Tammy McCreary had never been lucky in love.
I had dated some characters, so I know all the games, I know all the stories.
So when the mother of three went out to an Atlanta club one night in November 2007, love was the last thing on her mind. Until Eric Petit strolled by her table.
We kind of made eye contact, and I thought he was cute. The next time he came by, he just threw money over the area where I was sitting. And everyone was like, okay, well, drinks are on Tammy.
Eric told Tammy that he had just moved to town from Chicago and was looking for a place to buy. Tammy, a mortgage broker, gave him her card. 2 days later, Eric called, but he was more interested in Tammy than a house.
He said that he was an electrical engineer for one of the local utility companies. We started having lunch every day, and we talked all night. So things were moving pretty fast.
He was the kind of guy that would open doors for you. He would rub Tammy's feet, buy her flowers. He was a gentleman to her, and she seemed very happy.
As the relationship took off, Eric told Tammy some of the secrets of his past. He too had been married and had 2 young sons and a stepdaughter. But after his divorce, his life had taken a tragic turn.
In one of our conversations, he just mentioned his children. And of course, I wanted to know, okay, so where are your children? And he said his boys are deceased. And his parents were also deceased, and that they were all killed in a crash. So me being a mother, hearing that just sent chills through me.
In tears, Eric showed Tammy his son's death certificates. But that wasn't the end of the story. Eric told Tammy that before the accident, he had been an ER doctor in Chicago.
Eric did show me transcripts from University of Chicago, but he said that he could not practice after the death of his children. I thought it was sad that now he wasn't doing what was really in his heart to do because of the tragedy.
But 3 weeks after they started dating, Dr. Petit was called into action in spite of himself.
As we were driving, there was like a 3-car collision in front of us. I said, Eric, you gotta help those people. And so he jumped out of the car and he proceeded to help everyone. And I was impressed.
Just 1 month after they met, Eric found another way to impress Tammy. He asked her to marry him.
I said yes, but I made it clear that before we did anything, I definitely wanted us to have counseling.
But only 5 months later, Tammy would regret this leap of faith. On the night of May 18, 2008, at 6 p.m., the love of Tammy's life went into work a night shift and never came home. For months, reliable Eric always let Tammy know where he was.
Well, Eric always called me to see how I was doing. So this particular Sunday, it was really strange that I had not heard from him.
The next morning, when Tammy still had no word from Eric, panic began to set in.
So I called both cell phones. There was no answer. I waited a while and I tried the cell phones again. Still no response. So I called the hospital. I called in the emergency department.
What Tammy heard next would tear her new life apart. Eric had been at the hospital that night, but there was more to his visit than Tammy could have ever imagined.
I was at ground zero. I could not believe it.
Eric was very smart, but I've always heard that it's a thin line between genius and insanity.
In December of 2007, 5 months before Eric Petit suddenly vanished, he took his new fiancée, Tammy McCreary, out for a special surprise.
He wanted to go shop for rings, so he went to a store, and he said, let's look at a 3-carat Peerless in the antique setting. And the salesperson said, okay, this is $30,000. And I'm like, $30,000. So Eric says to him, well, just give me a day or two.
But later that night, Eric got a devastating phone call.
Well, I was sitting in the living room watching television with my mother, and Eric called her upstairs to speak with her for a second. Then I just heard a loud outburst. So I ran upstairs, and he was laying in my mother's lap, and he was crying very, very hard.
Through his tears, Eric told Tammy that his 12-year-old stepdaughter had committed suicide. As Tammy tried to comfort Eric, he explained that his ex-wife had no money for her funeral.
He was told that it was going to take $30,000 to cover the service, and he needed to take care of it. And I mean, I understood. And so I told him, we'll deal with the ring later.
Tammy suggested that Eric move in with her so he wouldn't be alone. But not everyone thought it was a good idea.
Everything was just coming all of a sudden, so I didn't trust him very much at all. I was like, you meet this guy who's not even from Atlanta, he's just moved here from Chicago, his family's dead. I said, what if he killed his family?
Tammy may have been in love, but she had 3 children to protect. So she decided to get Eric checked out.
I contacted a friend of mine who has a security firm, and I gave him Eric's information. And he came back to me and he says he's clean. He has nothing. So that made me feel very comfortable.
But one detail was rather puzzling. Nothing turned up about the accident that killed his children.
Whenever Eric talked about his children and the accident, he was very emotional. I've never seen a man cry like that, so I felt like he needed support.
So Tammy put her concerns about Eric behind her and focused on the wedding. To her delight, Eric took care of the invitations. And when the guests started to respond, she got a big surprise.
I had people calling me saying, Eric's a doctor? I didn't know you were marrying a doctor. So he showed me a copy of the invitations, and it said, Doctor and Tammy. He says, well, it was really supposed to be a wedding present for you. I'm going back into medicine.
Eric told Tammy he had been offered a job in the emergency room at a nearby hospital. It would begin after the wedding.
When he said that he was going to be starting working at the hospital, I was thinking, well, maybe there is some truth to this guy, so let's give it a shot.
4 months after they met, Tammy married her handsome doctor in a small ceremony in their living room.
I was very excited to know that I was going to be a doctor's wife. I just felt like this was the prayer that was answered. This was like a fairy tale.
Over the next 2 months, Tammy settled into life as a stay-at-home doctor's wife.
I would drive to the hospital every day, drop him off, and go back in the evenings and pick him up. Some days he would go in with a lab coat and he would come home in scrubs.
But sometimes Eric's new job seemed to take a toll.
There were a few times he would call very upset, telling me stories of a child coming in an accident and he couldn't save the child. There were a few occasions when he would get a call 3, 4 o'clock in the morning and he would have to leave and go to the hospital.
And the more Eric was gone, the more Tammy began to wonder. She had heard a few stories of doctors running off with their nurses.
I knew he was young, he was attractive, and he was the new guy at the hospital. So, I just started paying attention to different things.
Before long, Tammy found something that seemed to confirm her biggest fear. A sexy text message that had nothing to do with work.
Once I read the text message, it just didn't seem professional. So I just decided to call the number.
Tammy knew whoever picked up her call might very well ruin her fairy tale marriage. But she couldn't stop herself from dialing.
We were just like, oh my goodness, who is this guy?
Tammy McCreary sometimes worried that her new husband Eric might be too good to be true. So when she found a suspicious text on Eric's cell phone, she instantly feared the worst.
I just decided I would call that number back. And of course, it was a young lady. And she was like really friendly, like, hi. And I said, this is Eric's wife. Who are you? And her response was, if you want to know who I am, I suggest you ask your husband.
That night, Tammy got ready to have it out with her man.
I waited about 30 minutes, and then Eric comes charging into the bedroom. I've never seen him this angry. He says, you almost cost me my job. Do you know that was my superior that you called? And I just felt like some little teenager playing a little silly game.
Ashamed that her snooping could have cost Eric everything, Tammy decided to trust her husband, for better or for worse. But less than 2 months later, that trust would be destroyed forever. On May 18th, 2008, the good doctor went in to work a night shift. But when the next morning arrived with no word from Eric, Tammy knew something was seriously wrong.
I called both cell phones. There was no answer. So I said, well, I've never called the hospital, but I think I need to call today. Well, I called in the emergency department, and they put me on hold. Then they came back and they said, ma'am, there's not a Dr. Petit here. And I said, okay, well, I know they can't possibly know all of the doctors. So I decided to call the cell phone back. And this time I got an answer. So I asked for Dr. Petit. And the lady says, oh, are you talking about the guy that was using this cell phone? And I said, yes, because now I'm thinking, okay, finally, somebody knows Dr. Petit.
But what the woman said next was the last thing Tammy expected to hear.
She says, oh, well, you need to call security because that guy was arrested for impersonating a doctor last night. And I just lost it.
Police were called when a nurse reported that a man she didn't recognize had been hanging around the emergency room. The man was Dr. Eric Petit, but the hospital had no idea who he was.
He's dressed like a doctor from head to toe. He has a doctor's badge. He had taped his photo over the photo of the actual doctor on the badge. He had a prescription pad and some prescription drugs. And he was certainly getting around different controlled areas of the hospital.
For weeks, Tammy's husband Eric managed to roam the hospital undetected. And surprisingly, he had just one motive for playing doctor.
Most fraud cases involve people who are trying to get money. And it appeared that this guy was there to hit on women. One of the spokeswomen for the hospital said some of the female staffers described him as adorable.
But if Eric had been playing doctor just to meet women, what else was he lying about? Tammy was determined to find out.
Immediately, I just wanted to just start investigating everything that he had ever told me. I started going through his clothes. I was going through pockets, looking for pieces of paper, just anything. There was a duffel bag that was in the closet, and in the duffel bag, I saw papers.
Eric's web of lies was far from over, and Tammy was about to learn just how far he would go to deceive her.
I had no idea what this person was capable of.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. The day she found out her husband was arrested for impersonating a doctor, Tammy McCreary started her own investigation to find out who Eric Petit really was.
I was so afraid that someone would come back and say, hey, his name isn't Eric Petit. I mean, I just did not know what to expect.
Deep in Eric's duffel bag, Tammy uncovered another secret. A probation notice from the courts of Chicago.
So at that point, I'm thinking like, wow, I figured it had to be bad.
The probation officer explained to Tammy that Eric had been charged with check fraud, and there was a warrant out for his arrest. But then she heard something even worse.
And she confirmed that he did have 2 children. I said, were they deceased? And she says, no, not that I know of. So I looked at the death certificate and I contacted the funeral home. And they had never heard of any persons in there with those names.
The tragedy that had opened Tammy's heart to Eric was one of the most shocking lies of all. Eric had 2 sons by 2 different mothers, and both boys, along with his parents, were very much alive. What kind of man could lie about the deaths of his children?
That lie really scared me because now I had no idea what this person was capable of.
That really changed everything. It's one thing to just lie about your profession, but for him to say that his kids are dead, that is so heartless.
Eric had faked it all. The death certificates, the medical school transcripts, even his stepdaughter's suicide. It seemed the only thing Eric hadn't lied about was his name.
I wouldn't come out of the house. I didn't talk on the phone. I did nothing because I just could not believe that I allowed him to suck me into this with all those lies.
Even Tammy's background check had failed her. She had used the information on Eric's driver's license, and it was phony too. Now, instead of feeling careful, she felt like a fool.
I think her guards were totally down, which had not been that way for many, many years. And everything he had said, he had proven to her, so she had no reason to question.
On December 15th, 2009, Eric Petit negotiated a deal and pled guilty to identity fraud and theft. He was sentenced to 42 months in prison. But before he went in, he apologized to Tammy on the local news.
Tammy, you know, I'm very, very sorry for the things that I sent you through.
There was no doubt Tammy's luck in love had run out. Today, Tammy McCreary has made many changes. She has a job she loves, and for the first time in years, she's the one making the decisions.
My mom is doing wonderful today. I love this person that she has become. Go fish.
I am finally independent. I have my own life, and I'm just enjoying life. I'm enjoying my children. Okay, your turn.
But there's one thing Tammy isn't doing: dating.
As far as relationship, it's kind of like she's hit the delete button on that whole chapter. I believe that if someone was trying to ask her out, she wouldn't go out.
I don't think that you could ever truly know someone That is a very scary thought. But I will say, dismiss nothing. Things that seem to be small and little, don't dismiss it.
Growing up in rural Illinois, Ricki Lee Beneke was raised to always stand by the people she loves.
I always believed that I was a very faithful person. Never saw the bad in people. I always tried to find the good.
In the summer of 1987, when she was just 17, Ricki Lee saw plenty of good in 22-year-old Jeff Pilo.
He was in the service in the Navy. He had a great smile. It just lit up his whole face. We started going out to movies and dinner and realized we just couldn't be apart.
A few months later, Jeff got out of the Navy, and their relationship began to take off. Within a year, they were married in a simple church ceremony.
It was a church that I went to growing up. We had wanted to have a nice, perfect little wedding, but my dad had some serious health problems at the time, so it was just 5 people there, but we were both happy.
I trusted Jeff implicitly. They were a total couple. I mean, it seemed like they'd be together forever.
Money was tight for the newlyweds until June of 1989, when Jeff found a new way to serve his country by joining the police force in Bloomington, Illinois.
He always knew he wanted to get into law enforcement, and I always liked that he had a plan. He set out to make the streets a safer place.
The work was hard and the hours were long, but 6 years and 3 children later, Jeff and Ricki Lee still managed to keep the spark alive.
We would have 3 nights a month where it would be just the 2 of us. I'd plan a night, he'd plan a night. He'd bring me flowers, that sort of thing.
It was a great childhood. He'd always spend time with us. We always thrived on our daddy time.
But it wasn't always easy. As Jeff climbed the ladder at work, the night shifts and emergency calls became more frequent. The unusual hours began to take a toll.
He wanted to work as much as he could, but it was just hard as a police wife to get used to feeling like the job was more important sometimes.
But the effort paid off when Jeff was honored by a local organization as Policeman of the Year. In the summer of 2000, Jeff was promoted to sergeant, and Ricki Lee was thrilled.
I threw a promotion party for him, had cake, gifts. I had a little coffee mug engraved with Sergeant Pilo on it for him. I was so proud of him.
The future looked bright for the Pilo family. But 6 years later, all of that promise would suddenly disappear. On the afternoon of June 10th, 2006, Ricki Lee and the kids were driving home from the movies. Jeff was at the station and had just taken an exam for another big promotion.
We turned down the road our house was on, and I noticed a couple of vehicles there. I recognized them as being police vehicles, but not marked. My first thought was, Jeff had a bunch of people over after the test to relax and unwind from the test. Okay.
But the police weren't there for a party.
I had seen the assistant chief of police. I was like, there's no way he'd be here after a test for any type of gathering.
My heart just dropped, because you're taught your entire life, if you ever see another cop at your house, your dad's probably dead.
I got out, went up straight to the assistant chief. He goes, I know what you're thinking, but Jeff's okay. So I was like, oh, huge relief. All right, why are you here?
The Policeman of the Year was about to be stripped of his title, his badge, and ultimately his freedom.
It's the stuff that you see in Hollywood. You don't see this every day.
I was astounded. Are you kidding? This is a joke, right?
In the fall of 2002, 4 years before Ricky Lee Pilo arrived home to a house full of policemen, her husband Jeff was hard at work trying to advance his police career.
Jeff's just not a laid-back type of person when it comes to work. When he works, he puts everything into it.
I worked with him almost as closely as a partner. He seemed to be a good friend to people. He would go out of his way to help them.
But at home, the Pilos' once solid marriage was on shaky ground. Jeff's career, always a source of pride, was now pulling them apart.
I really started getting very frustrated with the job, with the amount of hours he was putting in, never being able to see him. I don't think that he really knew where to draw the line.
As the stress built, Jeff started to take it out on Ricky Lee.
He would come home from work. Oh my gosh, when's the last time this house has been clean? This house is a mess.
At times, he could even be cruel, making fun of a hearing defect she was born with.
He would get frustrated about her hearing, and it was like, you're stupid because you can't hear me. And I would get so angry. I said, Jeff, you knew about her hearing when you married her.
Sometimes I felt like I wasn't good enough, or that I didn't do things well enough.
By the spring of 2004, life at home seemed to improve when Jeff gave up the graveyard shifts for good. But he was still out at all hours of the night, and his family didn't always know why.
He liked to go on walks at night. It seems like crazy hours, but like 1:30 in the morning.
Jeff would tell me that there was a lot of times he just couldn't sleep, so he would get up and use the computer, take the dog for a walk, whatever, as a way of trying to relax.
While Jeff was releasing his tension from the day, Bloomington police had good reason for stress at night. A troubling new case was keeping them on edge. A serial rapist was on the loose, the first in the town's history. In the past 3 years, there had been 4 attacks, and the details were usually the same.
When the suspect was committing this assault, he was either wearing a ski mask or a scarf over his face. He would use duct tape to bind their wrists.
And it seemed that the rapist knew how to cover his tracks.
It was very frustrating because we had very little evidence. The suspect is taking things with him. He's making the victims bathe. He's doing absolutely everything he can to prevent leaving anything like DNA behind.
Investigators had no solid leads and no idea when the attacker would strike again. Meanwhile, Ricky Lee started to speculate about why her husband was really leaving the house at night. Some signs seemed to point to another woman.
There were times where I just had suspicions, I just had thoughts that, he's having an affair.
Finally, Ricky Lee decided to voice her suspicions.
I actually confronted Jeff about it. He completely denied it. He was angry. Oh, how could you think I was doing that? I can't believe you would even think that.
An affair would have been devastating, but the real reason behind Jeff's late-night forays would be far worse.
I wasn't prowling around anyone's windows. I wasn't prowling around at all.
In June 2006, Jeff Pilo was up for a promotion from sergeant to lieutenant in the Bloomington, Illinois PD. But first, he had to pass a big exam. On the night before the test, Ricky Lee urged Jeff to get some rest.
I got in bed and started reading. He said he was going to take a shower, joked around about some stress relief. Told me don't fall asleep. Well, I fell asleep before he got out of the shower. And I remember waking up very early in the morning, and he was laying in bed next to me asleep.
Meanwhile, that same night, the Bloomington police were about to get an unexpected break in their serial rape case. Shortly after midnight, a 911 call came in from the edge of town.
I'm just racking up my door. I'm running away, and my dog is going crazy.
What's your address, man?
On the night of June 10th, 2006, officer gets a call of a suspicious person knocking on the door, and the victim would go to the door and there'd be nobody there. When the officer arrives, he sees a figure with his back pressed up against the house, just trying to be as still as he possibly can. He calls out to the person, "Hey, you, come here, police, I need to talk to you." And the person turned around and walked away. As he's walking away, he's stuffing something in the front of his pants. So the officer drew his gun and it said, "Stop, police."
But when the officer saw the man's face, he couldn't believe who it was.
Eventually, the suspect turned around, and then all of a sudden it's, "Wait a minute, this is my sergeant."
Later that day, around 3 p.m., Ricky Lee was returning home from the movies with the kids. As soon as they reached the driveway, she realized that something was terribly wrong.
My daughter starts to pull in, and I told her to stop because I had seen the assistant chief of police. I told the kids to stay in the car. I got out, went up, straight to the assistant chief. He goes, "I know what you're thinking, but Jeff's okay." So I was like, "All right, why are you here?" He said, "Well, he has been arrested, and we do have a search warrant for your house."
The chief explained that Jeff had been caught attempting to break into a woman's house just after midnight. He was briefly detained and then let go.
To me, that made no sense because I never noticed him gone last night. When I went to bed, he was in the shower. I woke up, he was in bed next to me. You're lying.
But later that morning, after Jeff took his test, officers arrested him for stalking and attempted burglary.
I started yelling at the assistant chief and yelling at all the other officers there and really making a scene because it was just beyond belief.
But Ricky Lee would soon learn that the burglary arrest was only the tip of the iceberg. The police were sure they had caught their serial rapist.
Way back in 2003, we found records that our second victim had had her license plate run at a certain time and place that just didn't make sense. Well, the license plate had been run at that time by a in-car computer that was logged in under Jeff Pilo's login. 3 years later, all of a sudden, Jeff Pilo is found outside a woman's house at 1 o'clock in the morning trying to break in.
Convinced of a link, detectives pulled Jeff in for questioning right after his exam. During the interrogation, Jeff's behavior was bizarre.
All right, houses come up for sale in that area all the time. I'd be interested in buying my mother-in-law a house. I was looking to see what kind of access went down to that lake. That's all.
To me, that excuse of out looking for a house for my mother-in-law just had a lot of holes. It just didn't make sense. I mean, any police officer knows that you don't go up onto somebody's private property at that time of the morning.
This lady has someone prowling around her windows. There's nobody else out there but you. She's a very attractive young lady. It wasn't me. I wasn't prowling around anyone's windows. I wasn't prowling around at all.
Later on, when investigators put Jeff in a lineup, things only got worse for him. His striking blue eyes and distinctive voice would become the key to putting him away.
The main physical characteristics that all of the victims described was his eyes, how distinctive his eyes were. There's bright, piercing blue eyes.
Here's the deal. It's going to be half an hour. It's going to be a really bad half an hour for you. But if you don't make any noise, you'll get through.
The one I'll never forget is when we played the voice for our third victim. She literally curled up into a fetal position, pulled into the wall as soon as she heard his voice and said, "That's it, that's him."
As the case built around Jeff Pilo, one person still couldn't believe he was capable of such terrible crimes.
I know without any doubt in my heart that my husband is completely innocent of all these charges.
Ricky Lee stood by her husband, denying the charges to anyone who asked. But police had searched her home and found something so damning that it would shake even Ricky Lee's faith in Jeff.
Jeff says he's innocent. I've always stood by him. It was driving me insane.
Everything fell right in line. All the pieces to the jigsaw puzzle fell together.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In the summer of 2006, Police Sergeant Jeff Pilo stood accused of 4 shocking rapes. But his wife, Ricky Lee, was determined to stand by her man.
I said, we're gonna fight this. They cannot prove that he's guilty. Jeff says he's innocent. We'll get through a trial and be fine.
But when police examined the duct tape used to bind the victims, they found the evidence they needed to make their case.
A scientist at the FBI lab found fibers along the edge of the duct tape, and he was able to match those fibers to 2 separate articles of clothing that we found in Jeff Pilo's house. One was a nylon jacket that zippered up, and then also a ski mask. That jacket and that ski mask look exactly like what the victim described them as.
Then, on Jeff's hard drive, investigators made a shocking discovery that convinced them they had their man.
We were able to find pornography on his computer that it wasn't just run-of-the-mill porn, it was searches for brutal rape. There were images of uniformed people committing rapes.
Everything fell right in line. All the pieces to the jigsaw puzzle fell together.
Detectives learned that Jeff's attacks had followed the same pattern. He stalked his victims for months, using police resources to access personal information. Then he waited until the women were home alone at night and broke in. The attacks lasted for hours, and when Jeff was finally finished, he carefully took the evidence with him.
Can't explain to anybody what it's like to sit in one of those small interview rooms with the victim and go over 4 hours of her life when he was doing these things to him.
Still, Ricky Lee's faith in her husband was unshakable. Without any DNA evidence, she clung to the hope that investigators had gotten it all wrong.
As far as the ski mask and the gloves and the coat, in a house full of kids, every house, I'm sure you can go find the same exact items in. Jeff was the most sweetest, loving person. He never laid a hand on the kids or I in any way, shape, or form. It's like, this is just a bad dream.
On May 12, 2008, Jeff's trial began, and Ricky Lee sacrificed everything she had to defend him.
We had nothing. My retirement was gone. Our savings, gone. Credit cards all maxed out. Sold the house, all for lawyers.
But it wasn't enough to set Jeff free. A month later, a jury found the former Policeman of the Year guilty on all charges.
The jury came back and started saying, guilty. I just couldn't believe it. It felt like I died. That was the end of my life.
Despite a letter from Ricky Lee appealing for leniency, the judge threw the book at Sergeant Jeff Pilo. He was sentenced to 440 years in prison.
And the community looks towards their police officers to help protect them. And, you know, he put everybody here in a bad light, without a doubt. He betrayed everybody here. He betrayed this whole community.
I was just an emotional wreck because this nice, perfect little, wonderful family and life that we had all had was now completely shattered, and I just could not make any sense out of anything.
Today, Ricky Lee has a new apartment, a new job, and a new outlook on life.
I've made a lot of changes in my life, and really, I'm happy. I'm at peace, if nothing else.
After years of questioning, Ricky Lee has finally admitted that Jeff may not be innocent, but she's still not absolutely sure that he's guilty.
I gave up on trying to figure it out. It was driving me insane. Jeff says he's innocent. I've always stood by him. I want to believe that, but now I've stopped trying to figure it out, and I am just doing what I can for me to survive and go on.
I love him. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about him, but I want to know the truth. If this really did happen, come out and say everything, come clean. I just want to be able to know something.
Although Ricky Lee and Jeff remain legally married, she considers their union over.
Well, I'm sad in one hand because I always dreamed that marriage is forever. I also know that while I love Jeff, I always have, I always will. But we don't have a marriage.
The letter arrived without a return address, no fingerprints, no name, no explanation for why it had waited more than 20 years to surface, just a thin white envelope slipped through the slot of a small police department in Central Florida, postmarked from a city hundreds of miles away, carrying a few pages that would reopen a wound the community had learned to live with but never truly healed from, a case everyone thought had been buried by time, evidence decay, and fading memories, a cold case that never stopped breathing, never stopped whispering in the dark corners of the town, even as the calendar insisted the world had moved on. In 1999, Florida was loud, humid, restless, a place where neon signs buzzed through the night and afternoon thunderstorms washed the streets clean but never erased what people knew, what they suspected, what they refused to say out loud. And in that year, in a town most Americans would never remember, something happened that would fracture a community into before and after, a moment that froze itself into local history like a headline that never stopped echoing. It began quietly, too quietly for the damage it would leave behind, with a car that never made it home, a front door that never opened again that night, a family that waited longer than they should have before panic replaced routine. Because nothing about that day suggested it would end any differently than all the others, nothing except what would later be called the first warning sign, a detail so small it was dismissed at the time, then obsessed over for decades. The victim was known, not famous, not anonymous either, someone with roots in the town, someone whose name meant something to the people who lived there, someone whose routines were predictable enough to feel safe, whose presence had blended into the background of daily life until it was suddenly, violently removed, leaving a silhouette where a person used to be, a gap no one knew how to fill. When the report first came in, it sounded ordinary, almost boring, the kind of call police departments log dozens of times a week, a missing adult, no obvious signs of struggle, no blood, no broken glass, no frantic witnesses, just absence. And absence is the hardest crime scene to read because it offers nothing concrete to hold on to, only questions that multiply the longer you stare at them. Officers drove familiar streets under a sinking sun, lights off, radios crackling softly, knocking on doors, asking the same questions over and over. When was the last time you saw them? Did anything seem off? Did they mention leaving town? Did they argue with anyone recently? And the answers came back frustratingly consistent. No, nothing unusual. Everything seemed normal, too normal, as if the day itself had conspired to disguise what was coming. The house was untouched, keys still where they were always kept, wallet inside, personal items left behind, the kind of details that immediately raise red flags for investigators. Because people planning to disappear don't usually leave their lives neatly arranged behind them, and yet there was no forced entry, no sign of a fight, no chaos, only silence and the growing realization that this was not a simple missing person case. By the second day, whispers began moving faster than facts, spreading through diners, gas stations, school parking lots, theories colliding and overlapping, some insisting it had to be an accident, others convinced something darker was at play, and a few voices, quieter but more insistent, suggesting that this was exactly the kind of town where things like this happened, where secrets didn't stay hidden forever, They just waited. Search teams combed nearby areas, wooded patches, drainage canals, abandoned lots baking under the Florida sun, helicopters tracing slow circles overhead, volunteers calling out a name that echoed back unanswered, and with every hour that passed, hope thinned. Replaced by a heavier, more dangerous emotion, the sense that whatever had happened was already beyond repair. Detectives started mapping the victim's final known movements, building a timeline that looked solid at first glance, but crumbled under scrutiny, gaps appearing where no one could say for sure what happened or who was there. A stretch of time that refused to account for itself, and in that void, suspicion flourished. People close to the victim were interviewed again and again, alibis checked, rechecked, compared, inconsistencies noted, but never quite enough to make an arrest stick, because suspicion without proof is just noise, and noise is easy to dismiss when there's no body. No weapon, no confession. The case began to attract attention beyond the town limits, local news vans parking along quiet streets, reporters asking questions that had no answers yet, framing the story with words like mysterious disappearance and community on edge, while families locked their doors a little earlier each night and watched their neighbors a little more closely, wondering who might know more than they were saying. Then came the first truly strange detail, the kind of detail that sticks in investigators' minds long after everything else fades. A report of an object found not far from where the victim was last seen, something ordinary on its own. Something that could have meant nothing, except for where it was, when it was found, and how it connected to a detail no one had thought important before, a loose thread dangling in plain sight. At the time, it wasn't enough to change the direction of the investigation, not yet, but it was logged, photographed, bagged, and filed away, another piece of a puzzle that refused to show its full picture. Another reminder that this case was not going to resolve itself quickly or cleanly. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the urgency that once fueled the search began to erode, replaced by the slow grind of a cold case in the making, resources redirected, leads drying up, phone tips dwindling from a flood to a trickle, and finally to nothing at all. For the family, time didn't soften anything, it sharpened the pain, every unanswered question becoming a permanent fixture in their lives, birthdays passing without celebration, holidays marked by an empty chair, the absence becoming louder than any confirmation ever could have been. By the end of 1999, the case was officially unsolved, a phrase that sounds clinical but carries enormous weight because it means the story stops being about what happened and starts being about what never will be known. Never will be proven, never will be undone. But unsolved doesn't mean forgotten, not in a town like this, not with a case like this, because people remembered, they speculated, they argued, they pointed fingers in private and denied it in public, and somewhere beneath all of it, the truth remained intact, waiting, patient, untouched by the passage of time. Years later, when that anonymous letter finally appeared, when decades of silence were suddenly shattered by words typed on plain paper, it would force everyone to look back to 1999, to that quiet beginning, to that ordinary day that ended in disappearance, and to the realization that someone had always known more than they ever admitted, and that the past, no matter how deeply buried, never stays quiet forever. The investigation did not stall all at once. It slowed the way heat drains from asphalt after midnight, gradually, deceptively, until no one noticed it had stopped moving at all, and in those early weeks after the disappearance, detectives chased momentum like a fading echo, believing if they ran fast enough they could still catch it before it vanished into the noise of everyday crime. They returned to the timeline, not to confirm what they already knew, but to interrogate what they had assumed, retracing hours minute by minute, identifying the last confirmed sighting, the last verified phone call, the final interaction that could be anchored to a witness instead of memory. And what emerged was not clarity, but contradiction, small discrepancies that didn't scream guilt yet refused to align cleanly. One witness recalled a conversation that ended earlier than first reported. Another insisted they had seen the victim's vehicle later that night, parked where it shouldn't have been, engine cold, lights off, as if it had been placed there deliberately. A third walked back an earlier statement entirely, claiming stress and confusion had filled in blanks that never should have been filled. Detectives logged everything, every adjustment, every correction, aware that truth often changes shape before it reveals itself, but also aware that memory degrades faster than evidence, especially when fear and gossip infect a town this small, this tightly wound. Attention turned inward, closer to home, because statistically that's where it usually leads, not to a stranger in the dark, but to someone already known, already trusted, already overlooked. Interviews with friends and acquaintances grew longer, more pointed, and the tone shifted subtly from concern to scrutiny. One name began surfacing more often than the others, not because of hard evidence, but because of proximity, opportunity, and a pattern of behavior that made people uneasy in hindsight. At first, it felt like coincidence. By the third interview, it felt like avoidance. By the fifth, it felt intentional. The person denied everything, calmly, consistently, perhaps too consistently, offering alibis that checked out just enough to avoid collapse, but never quite enough to inspire confidence. Stories that held together under casual questioning, but frayed when pressure was applied. Detectives noticed the pauses, the moments where eyes drifted away, the way certain questions triggered defensiveness, while others slid off without resistance. None of it was enough to arrest, but all of it was enough to remember. Then there were the anonymous tips, a phenomenon every high-profile disappearance attracts, some earnest, some malicious, some desperate to matter, but buried among them were details no reporter had published, references to places not mentioned on the news. Descriptions that hinted at first-hand knowledge rather than speculation. Each tip was chased, each one consuming hours, days, sometimes weeks, leading officers down dead ends, false confessions, mistaken identities, until exhaustion set in and skepticism followed close behind. The line between useful information and noise blurring until everything sounded the same. One tip, however, refused to go away. It came in more than once, from different voices, describing the same late-night argument, the same raised voices spilling into the street, the same sudden silence that followed, and while no one could prove it had anything to do with the disappearance, the timing gnawed at investigators, sitting just close enough to the last known contact to matter. They canvassed the area again, long after footprints and tire marks had vanished, knocking on doors that had already been knocked on, asking neighbors to remember details from a night their minds had already rewritten dozens of times. Most couldn't offer anything new. A few offered too much. The case file thickened, not with answers, but with paper, transcripts, photographs, maps layered over maps, a physical manifestation of effort without resolution, and slowly, quietly, the investigation began to fracture, not from negligence, but from human limitation. Resources were finite. New crimes demanded attention. Detectives were reassigned. Leads went cold simply because no one was left to pursue them full-time, and the case slipped into that dangerous category where it was still open, technically active, but no longer urgent. For the family, this shift was devastating. Meetings with police became less frequent. Phone calls went unanswered longer. Promises of updates turned into apologies for delays, and the unspoken truth settled in like a weight. The system had moved on, even if they hadn't. Community pressure mounted briefly when a local journalist revisited the story, framing it as a failure, a mystery abandoned too soon, prompting renewed interest, renewed outrage, and renewed hope that this time something would break, that this time someone would talk. Someone did talk, eventually, but not in the way anyone expected. A former associate of one of the persons of interest came forward, not with a confession, but with a recollection, a comment made years earlier, dismissed as dark humor at the time, now replayed with new gravity, a statement about things that never get found, delivered with a smile that hadn't felt like a joke. Investigators tracked the associate down, recorded the interview, pressed for specifics, but memory had dulled the edges, details blurred, dates uncertain, and once again, suspicion hovered without landing, close enough to feel real, too distant to touch. By the early 2000s, the case had officially cooled. Files were boxed, shelved, revisited only occasionally, when a new detective inherited the department's unsolved cases and skimmed through, pausing briefly at photographs that still felt unfinished. The town adjusted. New families moved in. Old families moved away. The disappearance became local lore, retold with variations, each version drifting further from the original facts, and yet the core remained intact. Someone had vanished, and no one had been held responsible. What no one knew then, what no one could have known, was that the truth had not disappeared. It had merely changed hands, locked away not in evidence rooms or filing cabinets, but in a place far more volatile, a human conscience. Years passed. Technology advanced. DNA databases expanded. Cold case units were formed. The idea that no crime stays buried forever became a mantra repeated by law enforcement across the country, but for this case, progress remained theoretical, potential unrealized. Until the letter. When it finally arrived, decades later, it did not announce itself with drama. No threats. No demands. No confession written in bold strokes. Just information, precise, unsettling, impossible to ignore, written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing by finally breaking their silence. And with that, everything investigators thought they understood about the case would be forced back into question, not because the past had changed, but because someone had finally decided it was time to stop carrying it alone. The envelope sat on the metal desk longer than it should have, untouched, as if proximity alone could contaminate whatever calm remained inside the room, because anonymous letters had arrived before, dozens of them over the years, rambling theories, accusations fueled by grudges, confessions that collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions, and yet this one felt different from the moment it was opened, not because of what it claimed, but because of how it spoke. The language was restrained, deliberate, stripped of emotion, no attempts to shock, no pleas for understanding, just a sequence of facts presented with unsettling confidence, names spelled correctly, locations described with precision, times noted in a way that suggested reference rather than recollection, as if the writer wasn't remembering, but reading from a memory that had never faded. Detectives recognized it immediately, the tone of someone who knew the system, who understood how information traveled inside an investigation, what details mattered, what details would force a second look. And the first line alone was enough to reopen the file completely, not as a courtesy, not as a review, but as an active, breathing case once more. The letter described a meeting no one had documented, a conversation that supposedly took place within hours of the disappearance, involving people already known to police, but positioned differently than before, not as bystanders. Not as secondary contacts, but as participants in a moment that had never been acknowledged in any official timeline. It referenced a location investigators had searched, but at the wrong time, days too late, when rain had already erased what little evidence might have remained, and it explained why nothing had been found, not as a failure of effort, but as a matter of timing. A detail so simple it was devastating. There was no confession, not directly, but there was something colder, a map of responsibility implied through omission, through the careful arrangement of facts that left only one logical conclusion, and detectives felt the shift immediately. The sensation that comes when a case moves from unsolved to solvable, from mystery to math. Handwriting analysis ruled out matches from prior letters. The paper was commercially common. The ink unremarkable. No fingerprints were recovered, a sign of either experience or caution, but the postmark traced back to a city with only one clear connection to the case, a place someone involved had relocated to years earlier, far enough away to feel safe, close enough to still remember. Cold case detectives began the slow, meticulous process of cross-referencing every claim in the letter against archived reports, interview transcripts, call logs, anything that could confirm or contradict what the writer asserted. And to their quiet disbelief, detail after detail aligned, not perfectly, but close enough to eliminate coincidence. One passage referenced a specific argument investigators had dismissed as irrelevant at the time, recontextualizing it not as background noise, but as the trigger, the final escalation that pushed events past the point of control. And suddenly a moment once considered trivial became central. Another section described the movement of a vehicle not officially linked to the victim, explaining how it entered and exited the area without being noticed, why traffic cameras hadn't captured it, why witnesses remembered sounds but not sights. And as detectives reconstructed the route, they realized how narrowly they had missed it, how close the truth had passed them in 1999 without ever slowing down. The most disturbing detail came near the end, a reference to an item recovered early in the investigation, the object that had been logged, photographed, and filed away without follow-up, described now not as an anomaly, but as a message, intentional. Symbolic, placed where it would be found but not understood. That single paragraph forced investigators back into the evidence room, pulling boxes sealed for decades, reopening bags that smelled faintly of dust and time, reviewing photographs with new eyes, seeing patterns where there had once been randomness, intention where there had once been accident. As the review intensified, a name resurfaced with renewed gravity, not because it was new, but because it fit too well, aligning with every implication the letter made without ever being explicitly stated. A person who had lived under suspicion briefly before slipping away into obscurity, protected by the absence of proof and the passage of time. Detectives tracked the individual's movements over the years, a trail of addresses, jobs, relationships, none of them illegal, none of them remarkable, the life of someone who had learned how to appear ordinary. How to blend into the background without attracting attention, and yet something in that ordinariness now felt rehearsed. When investigators finally made contact, decades after the disappearance, the reaction was immediate, visible, a flash of recognition followed by controlled calm, a posture that suggested the past was not forgotten, merely managed. And the conversation that followed was careful on both sides, a dance of questions and deflections. The suspect denied involvement, as expected, expressed surprise at being contacted, claimed the letter meant nothing to them, dismissed it as fiction, but the denial lacked indignation, lacked outrage. The emotional markers detectives often look for when someone is falsely accused, replaced instead by caution, by the measured restraint of someone choosing words not for truth, but for safety. Investigators pressed gently at first, referencing details only someone close to the case would know, watching for cracks, for involuntary reactions, and though the answers remained controlled, the body language shifted, subtle changes in breathing. Posture tightening, eyes focusing too intently, signs not of innocence or guilt on their own, but of engagement, of stakes. Behind the scenes, forensic teams re-examined old evidence using modern techniques unavailable in 1999, extracting data from items once thought useless, searching for biological traces, digital patterns, anything the past might have left behind for the future to find, and while breakthroughs were limited, they were no longer non-existent. One item produced a partial result, not enough to stand alone in court, but enough to corroborate the letter's claim about proximity, about who had been where and when, and with that, the investigation crossed a line, moving from speculative to substantiated. The family was notified quietly, cautiously, informed that the case had reopened in earnest, that new information had emerged, that they should prepare for developments, not promises, but possibilities, and the emotional impact was immediate. Hope colliding with grief, relief tangled with anger, the knowledge that the truth might finally surface paired with the realization that it had been delayed for so long. As news of the letter leaked, the community reacted with a familiar mix of shock and vindication, conversations reigniting, old suspicions resurfacing, names whispered again after years of silence, and the town found itself pulled backward, forced to confront a past it had never truly resolved. The anonymous writer had vanished again, no follow-up, no contact information, no demands for credit or protection, as if their only goal had been release, not recognition, and detectives debated endlessly who they might be. A witness consumed by guilt, an accomplice seeking absolution, someone adjacent to the crime who had finally reached a breaking point. What mattered more than their identity, however, was the effect, because the letter had done what years of investigation had failed to do. It had reframed the case, narrowed the field, and reignited momentum that could no longer be ignored. And as pressure mounted, as interviews resumed and scrutiny intensified, one truth became unavoidable. Someone had lived for decades knowing exactly what happened in 1999, waking up every morning with that knowledge intact, and now, with the past clawing its way back into the light, the question was no longer whether the case could be solved, but whether the truth would survive exposure. The silence had been broken, and nothing would be the same again. The reopening of the case did not arrive with sirens or press conferences. It unfolded quietly, methodically, in interview rooms with stale air and fluorescent lights that hummed just loudly enough to make silence uncomfortable, where detectives relearned the discipline of patience, because after decades of waiting, the truth rarely reveals itself all at once. They began where the letter had pointed them, not blindly, not reverently, but with skepticism sharpened by experience, re-interviewing witnesses whose words had been preserved on aging tapes and yellowed transcripts. Voices from 1999 resurrected and placed side by side with present-day recollections, contradictions emerging not as lies, but as fractures formed by time and fear. Some witnesses were cooperative, relieved even, grateful for the chance to finally speak again about a night that had followed them for years like a shadow they could never step out of. Others were defensive, irritated by the intrusion, insisting they had said everything they knew already, bristling at the implication that silence might have been mistaken for innocence. One interview, however, stood apart. It was with someone long considered peripheral, a person who had brushed against the edges of the investigation without ever standing at its center, a name that appeared briefly in reports before fading into the background. In 1999, they had been deemed unimportant. In the context of the letter, they became essential. When detectives sat across from them again, the passage of time was unmistakable, hair grayer, posture heavier, but beneath the surface, the tension felt unchanged, as if the years had only compressed what they carried inside rather than easing it. At first, the answers came smoothly, rehearsed, familiar, stories repeated so many times they had hardened into something resembling truth. But as questions aligned more closely with the letter's details, the rhythm faltered, sentences grew shorter, pauses stretched longer, and a subtle but irreversible shift occurred, the moment when someone realizes the past is no longer safely behind them. The witness corrected themselves twice in under a minute, small details, inconsequential on their own, but together they formed a pattern, one that mirrored inconsistencies the letter had hinted at without ever naming, and detectives noted it silently. The way predators note weakness, without interruption, without judgment. Elsewhere, another team revisited a location mentioned in the letter, a place once searched hastily, inadequately, under conditions that made thoroughness impossible. Time had changed it, vegetation grown thick, structures altered, ownership transferred, but the geography remained stubbornly familiar, and with it, the possibility that something had been overlooked. Ground-penetrating radar swept across the area in slow, deliberate lines, technology the original investigators could only have imagined, and while it revealed nothing definitive, it confirmed what the letter suggested, that the site had been disturbed in the past, not recently, but enough to raise new questions about what had been done there and why. The suspect, meanwhile, remained just beyond reach, cooperative on the surface, evasive beneath, agreeing to interviews while offering nothing new, presenting themselves as a person wrongfully entangled in a tragedy they had no part in, a victim of circumstance and coincidence. Detectives tested that narrative carefully, introducing information in fragments, gauging reactions, watching for moments when composure slipped, when eyes lingered too long on a question, when breath caught unexpectedly. And though no single reaction betrayed guilt, the accumulation of them told a different story. Behind closed doors, prosecutors were consulted early, cautiously, their role not to pursue truth, but to measure proof, to assess whether the pieces forming in the shadows could ever withstand the harsh light of a courtroom, and their verdict was measured but clear. The case was stronger than it had ever been, but still fragile. The letter had cracked the surface. It had not yet broken it. As pressure mounted, so did the risk. Anonymous tips surged again, the community sensing movement, sensing vulnerability, eager to participate in a reckoning years overdue. Some tips confirmed old suspicions. Others introduced new chaos. Sorting through them became its own investigation, one that threatened to overwhelm progress if left unchecked. Then, unexpectedly, a second communication arrived. Not another letter, not written, not anonymous in the same way, but a phone call placed late at night, brief, clipped, distorted by poor reception and deliberate restraint, a voice that refused to identify itself but confirmed one thing: the letter was real. And it was not written lightly. The caller offered no new information, only validation, insisting investigators were asking the right questions now, before disconnecting abruptly, leaving behind nothing traceable except the certainty that someone was watching the investigation unfold, someone with a vested interest in its direction. That call changed the tone inside the department. What had felt like a historical review transformed into a live operation. Security protocols were revisited. Evidence access was restricted. Every move was documented with renewed precision, because now it was clear this was not just about solving a case, it was about containing the fallout. The family was informed again, this time with more substance, told that the case had reached a critical phase, that developments were accelerating, and though no promises were made, the implication was unavoidable. Answers were closer than they had ever been. For them, the waiting became unbearable all over again, a cruel repetition of the first weeks after the disappearance, hope weaponized by uncertainty, each phone call a potential turning point, each day without news its own quiet torment. As the investigation tightened, detectives uncovered a pattern that had been invisible before, a web of relationships that connected key individuals not through obvious conflict, but through shared secrets, favors exchanged, moments quietly buried. A social ecosystem that had protected itself instinctively, not through conspiracy, but through mutual silence. It became clear that the disappearance had not been an isolated act, but the culmination of tensions that had been simmering for years, personal, financial, emotional pressures converging in a single, irreversible moment. And while the letter did not explain motive outright, it illuminated the environment that made the crime possible. The suspect's alibi, long accepted as adequate, was re-examined under this new framework, and what once appeared solid began to erode, not collapsing entirely, but weakening at its edges, dependent on witnesses whose own stories were now in question. One of those witnesses requested legal counsel before agreeing to speak again. Another stopped returning calls altogether. These were not admissions. They were signals. By the time investigators prepared for the next step, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What had once been a cold case resurrected by a letter was now an active threat to long-held lies, and everyone involved could feel it, the pressure building, the sense that something was about to give. Because silence, when maintained for decades, does not break gently. It fractures. And when it does, it cuts everyone standing too close. The fracture did not announce itself with a confession or an arrest. It spread quietly, invisibly, through the people who had lived too long with the comfort of believing the past was untouchable, and detectives sensed it immediately. That subtle shift in behavior that happens when silence stops feeling safe and starts feeling dangerous. Phone calls went unanswered more often. Meetings were postponed. Witnesses who once spoke freely now measured every word as if it carried weight, as if it could tip something delicate and irreversible. The investigation had entered a phase where truth was no longer theoretical, it was approaching impact. Financial records were pulled next, not because money had been central to the case before, but because the letter suggested motive did not live in violence alone. It lived in desperation, obligation, and the fear of exposure. Bank statements from the late 1990s were resurrected, primitive by modern standards, but still revealing, patterns emerging slowly as analysts traced transfers, withdrawals, debts that spiked suddenly and resolved just as suddenly after the disappearance. One transaction stood out, small enough to avoid notice at the time, large enough to matter in retrospect, occurring within days of the victim vanishing, routed through an intermediary no one had connected to the case before. On its own, it meant nothing. In context, it became a question no one could answer easily. Detectives followed that thread carefully, aware that financial motive often intersects with personal betrayal, and the picture that formed was not clean or cinematic. It was messy, human, a tangle of choices made under pressure. Rationalized in the moment, regretted only later, if at all. The suspect was called in again. This time, the interview room felt different. The air heavier. The question sharper. Investigators no longer danced around details. They placed them on the table deliberately, watching to see what the suspect did with them, whether they reached for denial, deflection, or silence. The suspect listened, nodded, offered explanations that had worked before, explanations that sounded plausible in isolation, but now collided with corroborated facts, with timelines tightened by technology, with witnesses who had begun to remember things they once forgot. When confronted with the financial irregularity, the suspect hesitated for the first time, not long, just long enough to matter, and then dismissed it as coincidence, an old debt resolved, nothing more, but the explanation lacked texture, lacked the specificity of lived experience, and detectives marked it quietly, another crack in the surface. Outside the interview room, prosecutors weighed options they had avoided for years. Subpoenas were drafted. Warrants discussed. The threshold between investigation and prosecution loomed closer, but no one wanted to cross it prematurely, not after decades of waiting, not when one mistake could collapse everything. Meanwhile, the community began to feel the pressure too. Old friendships strained. Casual conversations turned cautious. People who had grown up together found themselves reassessing memories, questioning moments they had never examined before, wondering if familiarity had blinded them, if loyalty had cost someone their life. Local media picked up the story again, framing it not as a mystery reborn, but as a reckoning delayed, headlines hinting at betrayal, at secrets too heavy to carry alone, and though law enforcement remained tight-lipped, the message was clear. This time was different. Then came the break no one expected. A former witness, someone who had been cooperative but forgetful, reached out through an attorney, requesting a formal meeting, not to accuse, not to confess, but to amend their statement from 1999, a request that sent a ripple through the department. When they sat down again, their hands shook, not with age, but with fear, the kind that lingers long after the threat itself has passed, and when they spoke, their words fell carefully, deliberately, as if placing stones across a river they had been avoiding for years. They admitted to withholding information, not out of malice, but out of terror, fear of retaliation, fear of social exile, fear of destroying lives, including their own. They described a conversation overheard, a fragment of truth dismissed at the time as rumor, now revealed as something far more consequential. The account aligned with the anonymous letter in ways that felt impossible to stage, details overlapping organically, reinforcing each other without repetition, and for the first time, detectives felt the structure of the case solidify beneath their feet. This was no longer circumstantial fog. This was narrative. The witness stopped short of naming the suspect directly, but the implication was unmistakable, the story circling the same gravitational center, and prosecutors took notice, recalibrating their assessment, moving from cautious optimism to strategic preparation. As interviews continued, another individual invoked their right to remain silent entirely, a move that spoke volumes without saying a word, not proof of guilt, but a signal of perceived risk, of stakes suddenly recognized. The suspect's behavior shifted too. They became more guarded, less willing to engage, legal counsel appearing where none had been before, statements filtered, questions deflected, the cooperative posture replaced by defensive formality, and detectives recognized the moment for what it was. The window was narrowing. For the family, updates came more frequently now, heavier, more specific, and with them came a new kind of pain, the realization that answers were emerging not because time heals, but because pressure breaks, and that someone had chosen comfort over truth for decades. They grappled with conflicting emotions, the desire for justice colliding with exhaustion, the fear that resolution might bring not peace, but a fresh wave of grief, sharper than the first because it would finally have a face. As the investigation pushed forward, one truth crystallized above all others. The disappearance had not been an accident, not a random act of violence, not a tragedy without intention. It had been a decision, a sequence of choices made under pressure, enabled by silence, sustained by time. And time, once an ally to those who waited, had turned. Because now, every unanswered question felt like an accusation, every pause like a warning, and everyone connected to 1999 understood something instinctively, something no one said out loud. The past was no longer buried. It was rising. When the past begins to rise, it does not come up clean. It drags debris with it, fragments of lives interrupted, relationships bent out of shape by secrets held too long, and investigators felt themselves wading into something heavier than evidence. Something emotional, corrosive, a truth that had been soaking into the town's foundation since 1999. The task now was no longer discovery. It was confirmation. Detectives isolated what they believed to be the narrowest window of time, the critical span where everything had shifted from argument to action, from threat to consequence. They rebuilt that window using every available tool, cell tower records reconstructed from obsolete systems, traffic patterns simulated from archived data, witness movements mapped with precision that bordered on obsession. The picture that formed was not dramatic. It was mundane. And that was what made it terrifying. Nothing about that night screamed violence. No emergency calls. No public disturbance. Just ordinary movement, ordinary decisions, people going where they said they were going, except one person who wasn't. The suspect's timeline contained a pocket of unaccounted time, small, defensible on its own, but catastrophic when placed against the rest. In 1999, it had been ignored. In the present, it was unacceptable. Investigators returned to the financial thread, widening it, tracing not just transactions, but obligations, debts disguised as favors, arrangements that never touched paper. They interviewed people who had nothing to do with the disappearance directly, but everything to do with the pressure surrounding it, individuals who had benefited quietly when the victim vanished, opportunities that opened, conflicts that evaporated overnight. None of it proved murder. All of it explained motive. The anonymous letter had hinted at desperation, not rage, at a moment where someone believed they were about to lose everything, reputation, livelihood, control, and when detectives placed the suspect inside that psychological frame, the actions that followed no longer felt irrational. They felt inevitable. Another witness broke, not publicly, not dramatically, but in the way that matters most, privately, during a recorded interview that stretched late into the night. This witness had not lied outright in 1999. They had simply said less than they knew, choosing omission over deception, a choice that had allowed the case to die slowly. They described seeing the victim that night, not where they were supposed to be, but somewhere else entirely, a deviation from routine that had seemed insignificant until it wasn't. They described tension, not shouting, not violence, but the kind of quiet intensity that makes people uncomfortable, the kind that suggests something unresolved is about to surface. When asked why they hadn't spoken up sooner, the answer came easily. No one asked the right question. That answer lingered. Detectives now asked nothing else. They brought the suspect back in, not for confrontation, but for context, laying out the reconstructed timeline without accusation, inviting explanation rather than denial. The suspect listened, hands folded, expression neutral, but the cadence of their breathing betrayed concentration, calculation. When the unaccounted time was mentioned, the suspect filled it quickly, too quickly, offering a memory that had never appeared in previous statements, a stop made, a task completed, mundane details stacked hastily to seal the gap. Investigators did not challenge it immediately. They let it exist. Then they dismantled it piece by piece, introducing objective data that contradicted it gently, relentlessly, until the story collapsed under its own weight. The suspect fell silent. Silence is not confession. But it is not nothing. The interview ended without arrest, without raised voices, without resolution, but the shift was unmistakable. The suspect left knowing the ground beneath them had changed, that the comfort of plausible deniability was eroding, and that the investigation had reached a point where waiting favored no one. Behind the scenes, prosecutors moved faster now. They prepared for the possibility of charges without a body, a notoriously difficult path, one that required narrative coherence, corroboration, and motive woven tightly enough to hold under scrutiny. They needed one more thing. Something undeniable. The anonymous letter writer re-entered the conversation, indirectly, through a third party, a request passed quietly to investigators, a meeting proposed under conditions that emphasized anonymity above all else. No names. No faces. No recording devices. Only truth. The meeting took place in a neutral location, chosen not for convenience, but for control, and when the writer finally spoke, their voice matched the letter perfectly, controlled, precise, emotionally restrained, someone who had rehearsed this moment for years. They did not claim innocence. They did not claim heroism. They described the aftermath. They described panic, misjudgment, the belief that the situation could still be fixed, that silence could contain the damage, that time would eventually make everything survivable. They did not say who committed the act directly, but they described who took control afterward, who made decisions, who ensured nothing would be found. Their account filled the last gap in the timeline. It explained the absence of evidence. It explained the failures of the original search. It explained the decades of quiet. Investigators did not thank them. They did not reassure them. They documented everything. When the meeting ended, the weight inside the case shifted dramatically. What had been theory became structure. What had been suspicion became sequence. The family was informed again, this time with words chosen carefully, because there was no longer room for hope without consequence. They were told the case was nearing its end, not in closure, but in action, that the truth they had waited for was real, specific, and devastating. They listened. They cried. They asked one question. Why now? The answer was simple and terrible. Because guilt expires slower than fear. As detectives prepared for the final phase, warrants were finalized, strategies debated, contingencies planned. No one celebrated. No one relaxed. Everyone understood that the most dangerous moment in any long-buried case is when the truth finally surfaces, because people who have lived safely with secrets do not surrender them quietly. Outside the department, the town felt it too, the tightening atmosphere, the sense that something irreversible was coming, that 1999 was no longer a story whispered in the past tense. It was present again. And it was about to demand payment. The final phase did not begin with handcuffs or headlines, it began with containment, with the careful tightening of a perimeter no one outside the investigation could see, because when a secret survives for decades, it does so by adapting. And investigators knew that the moment pressure became visible, someone would try to outrun it. Surveillance was discreet, unremarkable, designed not to provoke but to observe, to capture routine rather than reaction. The suspect's life unfolded predictably: work, errands, brief conversations with neighbors who had no idea they were standing next to a man whose name now dominated quiet rooms inside the department. Nothing in his behavior suggested panic, but nothing suggested peace either, a man living in balance, careful not to tip. Detectives revisited the letter again, not for content, but for intent, rereading it not as information, but as a decision. Whoever had written it had chosen timing deliberately, waiting until witnesses were older, until loyalties had weakened, until the social cost of truth outweighed the cost of silence. It was not an act of courage. It was an act of necessity. Search warrants were executed next, targeted, precise, limited to avoid spectacle, because this was not about discovery anymore, it was about corroboration. Properties tied to the suspect's past were examined, not expecting miracles, but looking for consistency, for artifacts that matched the story now forming. In one location, nothing was found. In another, something was. It wasn't a body. It wasn't a weapon. It was a trace, a fragment of presence that should not have been there, embedded in an environment that had no legitimate explanation for it, and when forensic analysis confirmed its age, its relevance, the room went quiet, not with shock, but with recognition. This was the missing piece. The prosecution team moved decisively, assembling the case not as a spectacle, but as a sequence, motive, opportunity, behavior, corroboration, omission, the story told not once, but many times, from many angles, each reinforcing the other. Eliminating coincidence by accumulation. The suspect was arrested without incident. No resistance. No outburst. No denial shouted for neighbors to hear. Just compliance, quiet, controlled, as if some part of him had been waiting for this moment, rehearsing it in private for years, imagining how it would feel when the past finally reached forward and took hold. The news broke quickly, faster than law enforcement intended, names spreading through social media before official statements could stabilize the narrative, and the town reacted the only way it could, with disbelief layered over recognition. The uncomfortable realization that what had been whispered for years had been true all along. People revisited old memories with new clarity, reinterpreting moments they had once dismissed, a look that lingered too long, a conversation cut short, a sudden change in behavior they hadn't questioned at the time. The past reorganized itself in their minds, aligning into something coherent and terrifying. The family received the call they had waited decades for. Not closure. Not peace. Answers. They listened as investigators laid out the case, the evidence, the sequence of events reconstructed with painful precision, and when it was over, the silence on the line lasted longer than any words could have, because knowing what happened does not undo it. It only changes the shape of grief. The suspect was charged without a body, a bold move, rare, risky, but supported by a structure strong enough to stand, and as the legal process began, another tension surfaced, the question of accomplices, of those who had known, who had helped, who had stayed quiet. Investigators pursued it carefully, aware that accountability does not end with one arrest, but also aware that time had already claimed some of the answers, witnesses deceased, memories eroded beyond repair. Justice, like truth, would be partial. The anonymous letter writer disappeared again, their role acknowledged internally, protected legally, their identity sealed, not as a reward, but as a containment strategy. Their decision had detonated the silence. Their presence was no longer required. As pretrial hearings unfolded, the suspect's demeanor changed subtly, the control slipping in small, almost imperceptible ways, posture stiffening, gaze sharpening, the mask of detachment cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. In one hearing, the prosecution introduced the timeline reconstruction, laying it out clinically, step by step, and for the first time, the suspect reacted visibly, a tightening of the jaw, a hand clenching unconsciously, the body responding where words had failed. The courtroom absorbed it. So did the family. Outside, the town struggled with its own reflection, forced to confront not just what had happened, but how it had been allowed to happen, how comfort, fear, and loyalty had combined to protect a lie for so long. Conversations grew uncomfortable. Trust fractured. Some defended the accused reflexively. Others recoiled, ashamed of their own doubt. This was not resolution. This was reckoning. And as the case moved closer to trial, as strategies hardened and narratives solidified, one truth settled heavily over everyone involved, law enforcement, family, community alike. Solving the case did not restore what was lost. It only ensured that the silence that had protected the crime would never protect anyone again. The trial did not feel like a beginning, it felt like an excavation, layers of time peeled back under oath, every question cutting through years of practiced forgetting, because this was never just about proving what happened in 1999. It was about forcing the present to look directly at the past without flinching. The courtroom was smaller than anyone expected, ordinary, almost disappointingly so. Fluorescent lights, worn benches, the quiet hum of air conditioning fighting Florida heat, and yet every seat carried weight. Every movement amplified by the knowledge that this room would now hold what the town had avoided for decades. The prosecution began without drama, no grand speeches, no emotional overtures, just a steady reconstruction of events, building the timeline brick by brick, letting the facts speak in the only language that mattered now, sequence. They placed the victim back into the world as they had existed before disappearing, routines, habits, relationships, not to humanize for sympathy, but to establish predictability, to show how deviation stood out. Witnesses took the stand one by one, older now, voices softer, hands less steady, but memory sharpened by consequence. Some spoke with relief, as if testimony itself was an unburdening. Others spoke defensively, careful not to step beyond what they could legally survive, the past dragging at their heels even as they tried to outrun it. When the amended witness from Part 5 testified, the room shifted. They described the overheard conversation again, slowly, deliberately, no embellishment, no speculation, just what they had heard and what it had sounded like at the time, tension compressed into clipped phrases. The kind of exchange that doesn't explode immediately, but poisons everything around it. The defense challenged credibility, pointed to the delay, the years of silence, but the explanation landed harder than expected. Fear does not age out. It waits. The financial analyst followed, charts projected, numbers stripped of emotion, illustrating movement where there should have been stability, resolution where there should have been strain, and the implications settled in quietly. That the disappearance had solved problems no one wanted to admit existed. The defense objected frequently, not aggressively, but strategically, attempting to fracture the narrative into isolated facts, to remind the jury there was no body, no eyewitness to violence, no recorded confession. And they were right. But the prosecution never claimed otherwise. They leaned instead on accumulation, the weight of improbability, the idea that coincidence collapses when pressed hard enough. Each fact alone meant little. Together, they formed pressure. Then the anonymous letter entered the courtroom. Redacted. Stripped of identifiers. Reduced to substance. The judge allowed it not as confession, but as catalyst, contextualized by corroboration, and as passages were read aloud, a strange stillness settled over the room, the sound of paper carrying more force than any raised voice ever could. The defense argued contamination, suggestion, the danger of retrofitting evidence to a narrative sparked by an unknown source. The prosecution countered with precision, showing how the letter had pointed investigators toward facts already in existence, not invented, just overlooked. The suspect sat motionless throughout, expression controlled, posture rigid, eyes forward, the practiced stillness of someone who understood that reaction itself could be interpreted as guilt. Until the forensic testimony. The analyst explained the recovered trace carefully, methodically, emphasizing age, context, improbability, making clear how it could not have arrived by accident, how it tied the suspect physically to a place and time they had denied occupying. The defense challenged chain of custody, contamination, coincidence again, but the answers came back clean. For the first time, the suspect shifted. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The jury noticed. The family did not look at the accused. They looked at the floor, hands clasped, absorbing not just information, but the sound of their loved one being spoken about in the past tense with finality that had been delayed for far too long. As days passed, the courtroom rhythm settled into something ritualistic, testimony, cross-examination, objections, rulings, and beneath it all, a collective realization grew heavier. This case was not unraveling, it was tightening. The defense introduced character witnesses, people who described the accused as dependable, ordinary, incapable of violence, and the prosecution did not challenge their sincerity, only their relevance. Because ordinary people commit extraordinary acts when pressure compresses them enough. In closing arguments, the prosecution did not ask for anger. They asked for recognition. They framed the case as a sequence of choices, not a monster story, not a moment of madness, but a decision made under pressure and sustained through silence, a crime not just committed, but maintained, every day the truth was withheld. The defense responded predictably, emphasizing doubt, absence, the dangers of conviction built on inference, reminding the jury that suspicion, no matter how compelling, is not proof beyond reasonable doubt. When the jury retired, the town held its breath. Deliberation stretched longer than expected, hours folding into days, speculation rising outside the courthouse, commentators dissecting every testimony, every glance, every inflection, while inside the jury room, the case lived again. Argued and re-argued by people who had not known the victim, had not lived with the silence, but now carried the burden of judgment. When the verdict was finally reached, the courtroom filled quickly, tension vibrating in the air, and as the jury filed in, faces unreadable, the room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were waiting. The foreperson stood. The verdict was read. Guilty. The word did not echo. It landed. The family did not cry out. They did not celebrate. They exhaled, slowly, collectively, the sound of breath released after decades held too tight. The accused showed no visible reaction, no collapse, no outrage, just stillness, deeper now, heavier, the kind that suggests not surprise, but finality. But the verdict did not end the story. It opened something else entirely. Because justice, delayed this long, does not close wounds. It exposes them. And as the courtroom emptied, as the town stepped back into daylight carrying a truth it had avoided for a generation, one question remained unresolved, not legal, not procedural, but human. How many people had known? And how many had chosen silence instead? The verdict settled like dust after a collapse, coating everything without changing its shape, because conviction does not rewind time, it only redraws the map of responsibility, and in the days that followed, the town learned that knowing the truth was heavier than not knowing it at all. Sentencing loomed, but before it arrived, something else began to surface, quieter, less official, the aftermath that never makes headlines, the private reckonings that unfold when silence loses its power and people are left alone with what they chose not to say. Old friendships dissolved overnight. Family gatherings fractured. Names stopped being spoken aloud. The conviction forced people to examine their proximity to the crime, not just geographically, but morally, asking themselves whether ignorance had been genuine or convenient, whether loyalty had been protection or cowardice. No one liked the answers they found. Inside the department, the case was reviewed again, not for appeal, but for accountability. Supervisors examined early decisions, missed opportunities, assumptions made under pressure, not to assign blame, but to understand how a solvable case had been allowed to drift for so long. The conclusions were uncomfortable but clear. The system had not failed dramatically. It had failed quietly. A witness intimidated just enough to stay silent. A lead dismissed because it didn't fit the prevailing theory. A timeline accepted because challenging it would have required more resources than were available at the time. None of these were scandals. Together, they were catastrophic. The anonymous letter writer remained protected, their role acknowledged but unnamed, and internally, opinions about them diverged. Some called it courage. Others called it delayed responsibility. No one denied its impact. Without that letter, the case would have remained a footnote, a mystery softened by time. The writer never attended sentencing. They never contacted the family. They disappeared into anonymity again, leaving behind only consequence. At sentencing, the prosecution spoke briefly, aware that no length of incarceration could equate to decades of absence. They emphasized not punishment, but recognition, the formal acknowledgement that what had happened was real, intentional, and wrong. The defense spoke of remorse, of complexity, of a life that could not be reduced to a single act, and while their words were measured, they landed hollow in a room filled with people who had lived under the weight of that single act for more than 20 years. The judge listened, expression unreadable, then delivered a sentence that balanced severity with restraint, long enough to reflect the gravity of the crime, finite enough to acknowledge the passage of time, a decision that satisfied no one completely. Which was perhaps the only appropriate outcome. The accused was led away without looking back. For the family, the end of the trial did not bring peace. It brought quiet, the kind that follows noise, disorienting, uncomfortable, forcing them to confront the absence that had structured their lives for decades. Justice had arrived, but it did not fill the space left behind. They spoke publicly once, briefly, thanking investigators, acknowledging the anonymous letter without naming it, urging others to come forward sooner rather than later, their message simple and devastating. Silence protects harm. The town absorbed that message unevenly. Some embraced it. Others resisted, defensive, unwilling to accept complicity by proximity. Conversations grew tense. History felt unstable, as if it could be rewritten by whoever spoke loudest. Years of myth collapsed into fact. As appeals were filed and denied, the legal process moved on, but the social consequences lingered. People avoided eye contact in grocery stores. Long-held grudges resurfaced, reframed now through the lens of what might have been known and when. The case became a reference point, cited in training sessions, conferences, journalism schools, an example of how cold cases are not frozen, just waiting, and how resolution often arrives not through technology, but through human fracture. Eventually, investigators closed the file. Not ceremonially. Not triumphantly. They sealed it with a final notation, solved by corroborated testimony and evidence following anonymous disclosure, a sentence that compressed decades of pain into a line of text no one would ever read without context. The family visited the place where the victim had last been seen, not to reclaim it, but to release it, standing together in silence, letting memory exist without mystery for the first time. And yet, even as the case faded from public conversation, something lingered beneath the surface, an unease that refused to dissipate, because the conviction had answered one question, but raised many others. Who else had known? Who else had helped? Who else had chosen comfort over truth? Those questions did not go to trial. They remained in the town, passed quietly from one generation to the next, a cautionary inheritance, reminding everyone that justice delayed is not just justice denied. It is justice distorted. And distortion leaves marks long after the verdict is read. The letter does not end the story. It detonates it. Because once the words are authenticated, once the ink is dated and the envelope traced to a post office that no longer exists, the case doesn't close, it cracks open wider than it ever has. Detectives return to boxes sealed since the early 2000s, cardboard flaps bending under dust, evidence tags yellowed, handwriting faded. The room smells like paper and time. They pull out photographs no one has touched in years, the gravel turnout by the river, the abandoned citrus grove, the smear of tire rubber like a dragged sentence across asphalt. They read the letter again, slowly, aloud, each sentence a weight dropped into silence. The writer knows the hour, the weather, the sound. He knows what was carried and what was left behind. He knows the shortcut locals used to avoid the main road. He knows the dog that barked once and then went quiet. He knows a detail that never made the papers, never made the briefings, never made it beyond 2 detectives and a lab tech who retired in 2007. That detail is the key that turns. The community feels it before the confirmation comes. Rumors travel faster than press releases. Phones buzz at midnight. Old neighbors stare longer at familiar faces in grocery aisles. A man who once laughed too loud at the VFW hall now drinks alone. A woman who moved away in 2001 calls her sister and asks if it's true. The town holds its breath the way it did 26 years ago, only now the breath hurts. Reporters circle like moths around a porch light. Headlines sharpen. Cold case solved. Anonymous letter shatters decades of silence. Solved is a word people argue with. Solved doesn't bring her back. Solved doesn't return the missing hours. Solved doesn't clean the river. But solved means something else tonight. It means the silence has a voice. Investigators rewalk the timeline. Late afternoon becomes early evening. A routine errand stretches. A turn not taken becomes a turn taken. The letter insists on a meeting that never was a meeting, a coincidence dressed as fate. It describes a car idling with the radio on low, a song playing that the writer claims to hate, a smell of gasoline and wet leaves. It describes a flash of anger that surprised even him, a moment when control slipped and then hardened. He writes as if the act happened to someone else, as if the hands were borrowed. He writes that he didn't plan it, and then lists the things he brought just in case. The contradiction sits there, cold, undeniable. Detectives underline it in red. They cross-check every claim. Traffic logs. Weather reports. Old dispatch tapes hissed into digital clarity. A retired officer listens to his own voice from 1999 and goes quiet. A witness who once said nothing now says something small, then something larger, then breaks. The letter mentions a truck with a cracked taillight. There was such a truck, stopped once, waved on. The driver's name appears in a notebook margin, circled twice, dismissed because alibis seemed airtight and the town didn't want to believe. Alibis age poorly. People misremember. Clocks lie. And the letter names a place where a second object was hidden, not the body, not the weapon, but the thing taken and kept like a receipt. Search teams go out at dawn. The ground gives easily, as if it has been waiting. They find it where the letter said it would be, wrapped in plastic that has turned brittle, still recognizable. The lab confirms what everyone already knows. The room exhales. The suspect is alive. That matters. It means questions can be asked. It means the past can be dragged into a chair and told to sit. He lives 2 counties over, remarried, employed, ordinary in the way that makes neighbors defend him reflexively. When detectives knock, he opens the door without surprise. He has been waiting, he says. He says it like someone announcing the weather. He denies writing the letter, then stops denying. He says he wrote it to end the noise. He says the noise never stopped. He says he thought time would sand it down. He says he is tired. He says too much and not enough. The interview room light hums. The camera blinks red. He contradicts himself in familiar ways. He knows details he shouldn't know. He confesses to parts, then retracts, then offers a version that collapses under its own weight. Prosecutors watch from behind glass and begin to build. But the case refuses to be simple. There are gaps the letter doesn't fill. There are minutes unaccounted for. There is a second vehicle hinted at, never described. There is a witness whose memory doesn't align. There is the river, always the river, swallowing sound. Defense attorneys circle the contradictions, the age of evidence, the contamination risks. They argue suggestion. They argue desperation. They argue the letter could be a hoax built from public facts and lucky guesses. They argue that a man can know a town and still be innocent. The courtroom becomes a theater of time. Jurors look at photographs older than their marriages. They listen to experts explain fibers and probabilities. They listen to a mother's voice break on a word she has practiced for years. They listen to the defendant breathe. Outside, the town divides itself along old fault lines. Yard signs appear and disappear. Churches fill. A mural is painted and then vandalized and then repainted. Podcasts descend. Armchair detectives redraw maps. Someone posts a screenshot of the letter with lines highlighted like scripture. Someone else claims the real killer is dead. The sheriff's office releases a statement reminding everyone that speculation harms real people. It does. It always does. But speculation is what grows in the absence of certainty, and certainty is still out of reach. The trial grinds on. The anonymous letter is admitted, contested, parsed. Handwriting experts disagree with academic politeness that feels like combat. DNA offers fragments, not a full sentence. A juror watches the defendant's hands and remembers the line about borrowed hands and shivers. Closing arguments arrive like storms. The prosecution speaks of knowledge and opportunity and the arrogance of confession. The defense speaks of doubt and time and the danger of wanting an ending too badly. The judge instructs. The jury disappears. Hours stretch. A verdict comes back partial. Guilty on one count. Hung on another. The room reacts in layers, gasps, sobs, fists on wood. Justice incomplete. The sentence is heavy, but not heavy enough for some, too heavy for others. Appeals are promised. The letter sits in evidence, no longer anonymous, still accusatory. And yet, something shifts. The town walks differently. People say her name out loud. They visit the river in daylight. They tell their children the truth, not the softened version. The cold case label peels away, leaving a scar where it was. Solved becomes a word with footnotes. Solved with an asterisk. Solved in the way storms are solved when they pass and leave debris. The silence that lasted decades is gone, replaced by a low, constant hum of memory. Years later, when the cameras are gone and the podcasts have moved on, the letter remains the hinge everything turned on. It is taught in seminars as a cautionary artifact, confession as weapon, as relief, as lie, as truth braided together. It reminds investigators that time is not an alibi and that guilt sometimes waits for an audience. It reminds a community that secrets leak, slowly, inevitably, through paper and ink and conscience. On certain nights, when the air smells like wet leaves and gasoline, someone will swear they hear a radio playing low by the old turnout. They will drive faster. They will think of the line that mattered most, the one that broke the case open, the one that could not have been guessed. And the river will keep moving, carrying everything forward, even answers that arrived too late to save anyone, but just in time to end the quiet. Time does not close this story. It only changes the way it echoes. Long after the verdicts, the motions, the appeals filed and denied and filed again, the case lingers in places no transcript can reach. It lingers in the pause before people answer when asked where they were in 1999. It lingers in the way locals still refer to that stretch of road without naming it, as if the asphalt itself might answer back. It lingers in the evidence room, where the letter rests in a sealed folder, its words contained now controlled, stripped of their initial violence, but not their power. Ink on paper, still capable of bending lives. The man convicted grows older behind concrete walls. His hair thins. His voice loses its edge. In interviews, he alternates between remorse and revision, between owning the letter and minimizing the act, between silence and sudden floods of memory that arrive too late to be useful. He claims there are things he never wrote, things he never mailed, things he took to the grave in advance. Investigators listen, record, file it away. They know better than to chase every shadow. They know some truths are designed to be incomplete. The letter gave them a spine, not a skeleton. The rest is absence. The family learns what it means to live after an ending that is not clean. Closure is a word other people use. For them, there is only a narrowing of pain, a reduction of the noise. They hold a memorial that feels different now, heavier and lighter at once. They speak without wondering who might be listening. They say thank you to detectives who look older than they remember. They forgive some things and refuse to forgive others. They stand by the river together and watch the current slide past stones that have not moved in decades. Someone releases flowers. The water takes them immediately. Nothing stays. In town, the story settles into legend and warning. Parents point out places from car windows and tell their children to pay attention. Teachers mention the case when discussing ethics and evidence, how one document changed everything, how truth can arrive anonymously and still demand a name. The local paper runs an anniversary piece and then stops. New crimes happen. New headlines crowd the old ones out. But every so often, someone finds the scanned letter online, reads it late at night, and feels that same tightening in the chest, that same sense of being addressed directly by a voice that should not exist. Law enforcement agencies cite the case in training rooms far from Florida. They talk about cold cases and patience, about how technology helps, but conscience still matters. They talk about the danger of certainty and the necessity of doubt. They talk about anonymous tips and why most fail and why one didn't. They remind rookies that a case is never truly dormant, only waiting. The letter becomes an example pinned to a board, stripped of names, its sentences reduced to bullet points, its impact flattened by fluorescent lights. Even so, it resists. Even there, it hums. There are questions that never find answers. Who else knew? Who suspected and stayed quiet? Was there a moment when this could have been stopped, a call that could have been made, a door that could have been knocked on sooner? The file contains theories in neat handwriting and wild margins. Some pages are blank, placeholders for truths that never arrived. The river keeps its share. The night keeps the rest. Solved does not mean finished. Solved means named. On the anniversary of the letter's arrival, a retired clerk visits the old post office site, now a parking lot with faded lines. She remembers the envelope in her hand, the way it felt heavier than it should have, the way she almost put it aside for later. She did not. She tells herself that matters. Somewhere else, a detective who chased the case for half his career flips through a personal notebook and stops on a date circled twice. He thinks about how time rearranges priorities, how it teaches patience by force. He thinks about the cost of waiting and the cost of pushing too hard. He thinks about the one sentence that turned the lock. The community does not heal in a straight line. There are setbacks. There are arguments at town halls. There are moments when anger resurges without warning, when someone says the wrong thing and an old wound opens. There are also moments of grace. A scholarship fund. A bench by the river with a small plaque that doesn't explain itself. A tradition of leaving the porch light on one night each year, not for hope anymore, but for remembrance. The darkness looks different with light scattered through it. Years pass. New residents move in unaware at first. They learn slowly, through hints, through the way conversations pause. Some choose to leave. Some stay and adopt the memory as if it were their own. Memory is contagious that way. It passes from person to person, changing shape but not weight. The letter, once a rupture, becomes a reference point. Before the letter. After the letter. The line runs through everything. If you listen closely, the case speaks less about violence than about time. About what time hides and what it reveals. About how silence can be louder than confession until one breaks the other. The anonymous letter did not just accuse a man, it accused a town, a system, a decade of waiting. It demanded attention in a way nothing else could. And when it got that attention, it refused to behave. It complicated. It contradicted. It forced choices that had no clean outcomes. The river still flows past the turnout. Cars still slow there without knowing why. The radio still plays low sometimes, a song no one admits to liking. The air still smells like wet leaves after rain. These details remain, uncharged now, ordinary. But memory has a way of electrifying the ordinary. It turns places into questions. It turns silence into testimony. In the end, the case does not conclude with certainty, but with responsibility. Responsibility to remember accurately. Responsibility to doubt confidently. Responsibility to speak when silence becomes a shield. The letter shattered decades of quiet, but it did not shatter the need for vigilance. It proved that truth can arrive without a return address, that guilt can wait patiently, that the past is not done with us just because we are done with it. This is what remains, a solved cold case that still feels cold to the touch. A story told and retold, each time losing a little clarity and gaining a little gravity. A town that learned how fragile its peace was. A family that learned how to live with answers that arrived too late to save, but early enough to matter. And a piece of paper that moved from hand to hand, from anonymity to evidence, carrying with it the sound of silence breaking, finally, after 26 years and the echo that followed, refusing to fade. The story does not stop expanding just because the chapters were supposed to end. It keeps pushing outward, seeping into years that were never meant to carry its weight. Long after the last gavel strike fades from memory, the case continues to surface in unexpected places, like something buried shallow, never quite staying under. A footnote in a legal journal. A line in a psychology lecture about delayed confession. A documentary clip spliced into a montage of unanswered questions. Each time, the same quiet returns afterward, thicker than before, because now the silence knows what it is hiding. The letter's language is studied more than the crime itself. Analysts dissect the syntax, the rhythm, the way certainty and evasion share the same sentence. They point out the deliberate pauses, the false humility, the moments where detail spikes too sharply to be accidental. They argue about intent. Was it guilt seeking release or control seeking the final word? Some say both. Some say neither. The letter refuses to settle into one meaning. It behaves like its author did for decades, present, evasive, manipulative, undeniably real. The investigators who lived with the case carry it differently now. For some, it is a vindication that arrived late, an answer that proves persistence matters even when it looks foolish from the outside. For others, it is a reminder of every turn that could have been taken sooner, every instinct that was talked down in the name of procedure. They replay conversations in their heads, wondering what might have happened if one more question had been asked, one more door knocked on at the right time. They know this thinking changes nothing. They do it anyway. In the archives, the case file grows heavier with commentary rather than evidence. New notes are added in different inks, different hands. Margins fill with references to appeals, denials, psychological evaluations, community impact statements. The physical truth of the crime remains frozen, but the interpretation evolves constantly. It is no longer just a murder investigation. It is a study in waiting, in pressure, in what happens when time becomes an accomplice. The town itself becomes a living document. Businesses open and close. Roads are repaved. The old turnout is partially obscured by new signage, as if infrastructure could overwrite memory. It can't. People still lower their voices when they pass through that area. Still glance at the river with an expression they can't quite explain. Newcomers sense it before they understand it. Something happened here. Something that never fully left. The family learns to navigate a strange duality: public resolution, private incompleteness. Strangers approach them with sympathy sharpened by curiosity. Some want to thank them for their strength. Some want details they have no right to ask for. The family develops a practiced way of responding, polite but firm, protecting what little is left that belongs only to them. At home, photographs stay on the walls. Laughter returns in pieces. Life resumes, but it never resets. The convicted man becomes a reference rather than a presence. His name appears in databases, in appellate opinions, in late-night discussions about whether confession can ever be trusted when it arrives on its own schedule. He gives fewer interviews now. When he speaks, his words feel recycled, smoothed down by repetition. He claims clarity. He claims regret. He claims fatigue. None of it changes the record. None of it changes the river. Every few years, a rumor surfaces. A supposed accomplice. A hidden tape. A second letter that was never mailed. Each one flares briefly, then dies under scrutiny. Investigators check anyway. They always check. That is the final lesson the case leaves behind. You check because not checking is how silence wins. In classrooms, students debate the ethics of publishing the letter in full. Does exposure serve justice, or does it reward the author's need for control? Professors let the arguments run long. There is no clean answer. The case does not provide one. It only provides consequences. Every choice made around it carries weight. What to release, what to redact, what to say out loud, what to leave implied. The river remains indifferent. It does not mark anniversaries. It does not recognize closure. It moves at the same pace it always has, carrying leaves, branches, reflections of passing clouds. People project meaning onto it because they need somewhere to place what cannot be resolved. The water accepts this without comment. It accepts everything. Late at night, when the town is quiet and the air is heavy with humidity, the story feels closest. Not in fear, but in awareness. A sense that history is not behind us, only layered beneath us. That every place holds more than one moment at a time. That a single envelope, dropped into a mailbox, can bend decades and still not straighten them. This is the final truth the case offers, if it offers one at all. Answers do not arrive as endings. They arrive as interruptions. They break routines, reopen rooms, force the living to renegotiate their relationship with the past. The anonymous letter did that. It did not heal. It did not restore. It disrupted a silence that had begun to feel permanent, and in doing so, it changed everything that came after. And so the story continues, not forward, but outward. In memory. In caution. In the way people hesitate before dismissing an old case as finished. The silence is gone now, replaced by something less comfortable but more honest. A low, constant awareness that the past is capable of speaking at any time, and that when it does, it will not ask permission, it will not explain itself, and it will never arrive exactly when anyone is ready to hear it.